this video, we're going to be taking a look at the initial configuration of our beer test using Spring MockMVC. So we're just going to go through the initial configuration of that MockMVC. So we do have our beer controller. This does have one dependency that is on the beer service. We're using Project Lombok to provide actually we should say that should be required args. That should actually be a required args constructor, not all args. So that was a mistake from previously, but we do want required args. That will require a constructor for that, being that it's a final property. That'll give us our constructor there. And this is a very simple dependency that we do have with the beer service. So let's come over to our test. You can see our test here. It wasn't a very good test. It was just make sure that we're getting some type of output to console. And we were just looking at the Spring Boot functionality. And in this case, I'm going to comment out the Spring Boot test. And here what we want to do is bring in the WebMVC test. So that is now indicating that this is a test splice. And I specifically want to limit this to the beer controller class. If we omit the controller in the annotation, it'll try to bring up all controllers, and we don't necessarily want to do that because then we'd have to be managing the dependencies for all of them. So here I'm going to also comment this out, and we can comment this. I'm just going to comment things out so you can see the changes I'm making. And I will go back and delete those here at the end of the lesson. So now we want to bring in a dependency of AutoWriter on MockMVC. So this sets up Spring MockMVC. This brings in that MockMVC component that is going to get auto-wired by the Spring framework. And this is going to require a beer service in the context. So what we can do here, say beer service. Now the annotation that we can do here, since this is a Spring test, we are bringing out Spring context, we can say mock bean. So the mock bean annotation basically tells Mockito to provide a mock of this into the Spring context. So they work together quite nicely. So without this mock bean, we would get an exception saying that we don't have that dependency there. We'd have to provide it manually. So this is what adds the beer service into the Spring context, but it's adding the beer service as a Mockito mock. And by default, Mockito mocks are going to return back a null response. They won't complain at all, but they will return back a null response. So what we can do is come in and say MockMVC perform. Now this gets a little tricky with the static input ports. We're going to say get, and we need to import a static method here. And sometimes IntelliJ doesn't like to bring that up. And what we need to do here is we'll just go ahead and import that directly. So we'll come up here. And here it's going to be org, Spring Framework, test, web, servlet, request, MockMVC request builder, and get. So for some reason, sometimes IntelliJ doesn't like to bring that up, but that is the import that you do need. So the import static or Spring Framework, test, web, servlet, request, MockMVC request builder, get. Now this is going to go against our API v1 here, and we are going to pass in a random UID for our purposes right now. And we can say accept. I'm going to get the application JSON. I'm sorry, this is off the screen. And let's scroll this up a little bit. And you can see that we're getting a red squiggly there. What we want to do is add an exception to the signature. And then part of MockMVC, now we can say, and expect. Again, we need to bring in a static method. And just so you can see that, again, almost the same package except dot result, MockMVC result matchers. So that is going to set up the matcher. So what we're saying here with MockMVC is that we want to perform a get against this URL, API v1 beer with a random unit, and we should get back an OK status. So let's go ahead and run that. Make sure that we do in fact get a result back. And we ran it. It should be, I think it's because I'm missing the /. Let's try that. So now our test is running green. So a big difference from the previous test that we had. Here, we are actually using the web framework to perform a get action, and that is actually going to be invoking the get beer So within beer controller here, we are going to be invoking the get beer by ID. So I can come here, set a debug point, and I can actually verify that. So let's double check that we are in fact hitting that controller. You can see that I am hitting that point. And the beer service that you can see here, that is a Mockito mock. So when Spring has done that, it's actually providing that, but Mockito is just returning back a null. So our test isn't doing all the proper assertions because we're not getting anything back. So we do want to be testing for that, and we will enhance the test for that. But for now, I'm just going to stop this. And just to reiterate what we changed here. So we changed from using Spring Boot test to WebMVC test specifically for the beer controller. We no longer need to auto wire in the beer controller because we are going to be using the MockMVC context. On line 22 there, we are using the mock bean annotation, tell Mockito to create a mock instance of that. So that bean, that adds that bean into the Spring context, which allows Spring to auto wire that Mockito mock into the beer controller that is being managed by the Spring context. And now we are telling MockMVC to perform a get operation against /API v1 beer with a random unit in it, and we are getting back a 200 status. So that is functionally working. We'll get rid of our rather crude system outline. And now that is our test. So this very rudimentary test, but now we are using Spring MockMVC to test one of our controller methods.